Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, in other news, President Trump has announced a meeting is being planned between him and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. The two leaders have been exchanging threats and insults for the duration of Trump's presidency, but the promise of face-to-face talks suggests relations have thawed. In the past hour, Vice President Mike Pence said the breakthrough was evidence that President Trump's strategy to isolate the Kim regime is working. Well, let's take a look back at that war of words between the two leaders. In August last year, Mr. Trump said North Korea would be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen if it continued to threaten the US. He then, you may remember, called Kim Jong-un Rocket Man in his address to the UN General Assembly. Kim Jong-un hit back with a statement describing the president as a mentally deranged US dotard. Earlier this year, the North Korean leader then warned he had a nuclear button on his desk. Mr. Trump quickly responded by saying his own nuclear button is much bigger and more powerful. Well, since then, relationships have thawed slightly, and last month, North Korea and South Korea competed under a joint flag at the Winter Olympics. And after talks between the two countries this week, South Korean diplomats said the North is willing to denuclearize if its security is guaranteed. That led Mr. Trump to tweet overnight that great progress is being made and that a meeting between himself and Kim Jong-un is being planned. Let's go live now to Washington, where we can speak to our US correspondent, Mark Austin. A major development, Mark, and one that came as something of a surprise.
Yes, to an awful lot of people here. It's a real gamble by Donald Trump. It's a gamble to have this meeting at all. Certainly, I think, a gamble to have it so quickly. And he caught everybody, as you say, by surprise. He wasn't due to meet these South Korean officials until today. I mean, he heard they were in the White House last night, so he went in to see them, wanted to know what this letter was from Kim Jong-un. He heard about it, and he made a pretty quick decision that he would have this meeting. He took the White House staff by surprise. He took the Pentagon, certainly was caught on the hop, and Rex Tillerson, his Secretary of State, who's in Africa, had only said a few hours before that the time wasn't right for a meeting between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. So he was caught on the hop as well. Once he'd gathered himself over in Africa, this is what he had to say.
This was the most forward-leaning report that we've had in terms of Kim Jong-un's not just willingness, but his strong desire for talk. So I think it was really what changed was his posture in a fairly dramatic way that, in all honesty, came as a little bit of a surprise to us as well, that he was so forward-leaning in his conversations with the delegation from South Korea.
Tillerson made it clear that this was Donald Trump's own decision to do this, but the Trump team is rallying around behind him. Mike Pence, the vice president, has issued a statement saying this. He said North Korea's desire to meet to discuss denuclearization while suspending all ballistic missile and nuclear testing is evidence that President Trump's strategy to isolate the Kim regime is working. The North Koreans are coming to the table despite the United States making zero concessions and in close coordination with our allies. We have consistently increased the pressure on the Kim regime. And a lot of that is absolutely true. They have kept up the pressure. Will this meeting happen? I think it probably will now. Where is in doubt. It might happen on the border between the two Koreas. Unlikely Kim Jong-un would come here. Very unlikely Donald Trump would go to North Korea. And just finally, why is it such a gamble? I think it's because Donald Trump has already handed the real coup here to Kim Jong-un. This is an untested, very young dictator. I don't think he's ever met a world leader, and now he's meeting the most powerful man in the world. So for Donald Trump, it's a gamble. He has to come away with something, but it's a bold gesture, typical of the president in many ways. And if it does down the road lead to a real lowering of tensions, some form of denuclearization and a durable peace, then that will be quite some legacy for Donald Trump, but it's way off yet.
OK, Mark Austin, thanks very much. Let's stay with this story now, and I'm joined from southwest London by Jim Hoare, a former British diplomat in North Korea from 2001 to 2002. Good afternoon to you, Jim Hoare. As Mark Austin was just saying there, this is a gamble, but just how high are the stakes?
If it's peace in East Asia, then clearly it's worth doing, whatever the stakes are, however high they are. I think the tone of caution that your correspondent just gave at the end is the right one, though. If this meeting comes off, there's an awful lot of possible problems before then. But if it did come off, and if it was successful, and I'm not sure that Mr. Pence saying, you know, we've done it because we put pressure on them, is the right way to go about making it successful. But it could mean that North Korea would not proceed any further with its nuclear and rocket program. I don't think they'd give it up entirely, but they might agree to a cap. And that would actually make everybody sleep easier in South Korea, in Japan, and maybe even in China.
Yeah, this appeared to be a unilateral decision taken by Donald Trump. It took his Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, by surprise last night. And Donald Trump is known for his fly-by-the-seat-of-his-pants diplomacy, isn't he? But has he given up too much too soon?
I don't think really he's given up anything at the moment. I mean, the initiative, in a sense, came from the North Koreans. Mr. Kim said he would be willing to have a talk. Mr. Trump had, in the past, even before he was president, had said he'd be very willing to talk to the North Koreans, or at least he'd be willing, and that he would even have a meal with Kim Jong-un. So it was always possible that something like this would happen. Since at least July last year, Kim Jong-un has been indicating that he'd be willing to talk to the United States. The terms of what they talk about, of course, is a big difficulty, but it isn't something that's come completely out of the blue. But you're right, the suddenness with which Mr. Trump has acted is, I think, a shock for many people.
I was asking, I suppose, in the sense that Donald Trump has given him a meeting straight away. That would have been, if you excuse the pun, his trump card. I wonder what the motivation is for Kim Jong-un here. Are we suddenly expecting him to agree to give up the nuclear capabilities North Korea spent so many years building up? Or is this more about him saying, well, look what I've achieved, now the US is treating me as an equal?
I think there's probably all sorts of things mixed up in the process. I think the North Koreans, as I said, are unlikely to give up everything. They might agree to a cap. They did that back in 1994, and it worked for several years. And it could have carried on working if the decision hadn't been made to pull back from it. But it is difficult. It always requires somebody to make an early move. In a sense, you could say Mr. Trump reacted to the offer from Mr. Kim. And so who made the first move? Mr. Kim did. And it's fortunate that it fell on apparently fruitful ground. But there are many problems ahead, even before you get to the negotiating table. It's going to be very difficult for them to agree on an agenda. It may well be difficult for them to agree on a place to actually hold a meeting. There's problems with most of them. And it's certainly not going to be easy, I think, for the Trump team, the people who actually have to translate his statements now into reality, to carry out these negotiations, given the very weak team he has allowed to emerge on the Korean Peninsula, that there is no American ambassador in Seoul, that there is only a temporary head of the East Asian Bureau in State Department. These are things that matter when it comes to actually negotiating with the other side. You need knowledge and you need experience. And the Americans aren't terribly good on that at the moment.
No, OK. Lots of questions still to be answered. Jim Hoare, thanks very much for your analysis today.
The old dotard is to meet Little Rocket Man. President Trump says he'll hold talks with North Korea's Kim Jong-un in an historic meeting between the two leaders. The apparent breakthrough took the US by surprise and comes after months of growing tension in which the two men have traded insults. South Korean officials who brokered the talks describe it as a miracle and say the North is now committed to denuclearisation and has promised to halt all nuclear and missile tests. Our North America correspondent Nick Bryant has more.
Last night, the precincts of the White House felt more like the Twilight Zone. Donald Trump slipping into the press briefing room unannounced to tell reporters to expect a major announcement.
Here we go.
Then out from the West Wing came a delegation from South Korea to make one of the most stunning diplomatic statements in decades after delivering to Donald Trump a message from Kim Jong-un.
He expressed his eagerness to meet President Trump as soon as possible. President Trump appreciated the briefing and said he would meet Kim Jong-un by May to achieve permanent denuclearization.
Prior to arriving in Washington, they'd held a meeting in Pyongyang, with Kim Jong-un offering a warm hand of friendship rather than rattling his usual saber. And on state TV, the schmaltzy soundtrack doubled as diplomatic mood music because the North Korean leader offered to abandon his country's nuclear arsenal in return for security guarantees from the United States. Then came this sentimental farewell, Kim Jong-un sending them off not just with a wave, but an invitation to Mr. Trump, the most improbable of overtures. Donald Trump gave his response on Twitter. Great progress being made, but sanctions will remain until an agreement is reached. Meeting being planned. The White House claims his tough talk has worked.
They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen.
Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
Washington has been in a whirlwind, taken completely by surprise, because shortly before the shock announcement, America's chief diplomat had ruled out direct talks with Pyongyang.
In terms of direct talks with the United States, and you asked negotiations, and we're a long ways from negotiations.
This is a huge gamble which offers Pyongyang a propaganda coup without much diplomatic groundwork, without a guarantee of success. But all of Donald Trump's presidential predecessors have failed to halt North Korea's nuclear program. So perhaps it's worth this dramatic new gesture. Two combustible leaders dealing with what's potentially the world's most combustible problem. Diplomacy like a Las Vegas title fight, the international summit of the century. Nick Bryant, BBC News, Washington.
Well, as we heard there, today's announcement follows something of a thaw of relations between North and South Korea that saw them march under a single flag at the Winter Olympics. The South Korean President, Moon Jae-in, described the planned meeting with its unpredictable and heavily armed neighbour as a milestone for peace. But how's the news gone down in the capital, Seoul? Laura Bicker has been finding out.
For months, Seoul wondered if it faced the prospect of war once again. Today, it woke to better news. The prospect of a stunning Trump-Kim summit has turned an impending crisis into an opportunity. The horror of the Korean War is not forgotten here. The fighting ended with no peace treaty. Now future generations hope these talks will prevent further confrontation.
I think this will be a turning point, and through this our future children will benefit from living in a more free and peaceful world.
I think it is a good thing for both countries. And as a South Korean citizen, it's good that the threat of war has reduced even by a little.
Even if things turn out well, it won't benefit the people in North Korea. In the past, when the South Korean president provided aid to North Korea, I heard almost none of it went to the common people. So I don't think it's going to turn out well.
Decades of distrust and suspicion divide North and South. People have learned that hope can be a bad thing. I'm told it's hard to tell what is real progress and what is propaganda.
A strong word of caution. The road ahead is very long, very complicated, very complex, and there's no guarantee that the North will ever give up its nuclear weapons easily, if at all.
These talks are a huge political gamble. Presidents Moon and Trump could be being played by Pyongyang. or this peninsula could be on the verge of something it's been searching for nearly 7 decades, a peace treaty.
This statue portrays two brothers divided by the war in a last desperate embrace. There's a sense of cautious optimism that this unresolved conflict could now have a happier ending. Laura Bicker, BBC News, Seoul.
President Trump has agreed to hold unprecedented face-to-face talks with North Korea's Kim Jong-un. The sudden announcement shocked many, not least because the leaders have long waged a war of words. It's hoped the historic meeting could halt the North's nuclear ambitions, but some fear the gamble won't pay off and simply give legitimacy to Kim Jong-un. Well, in a moment we'll have the latest from Washington and Beijing. But first to our Washington correspondent, Robert Moore, on the role of the nuclear dice.
There were times on the campaign trail when the maverick candidate would hint that he was open to talking directly to Kim Jong-un, mocking the outrage that would come with such a gesture.
Trump would speak to him. Who the hell cares? I'll speak to anybody.
But once he was in office, Trump escalated the rhetoric against North Korea.
They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen.
And on even the biggest stage, he sought to belittle and humiliate Kim Jong-un.
Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
It makes the overnight developments in Washington even more astonishing. South Korean officials emerging from the White House to announce one of the most unlikely summit meetings in the long history of diplomacy. It had started with a direct request from Kim Jong-un.
He expressed his eagerness to meet President Trump as soon as possible. President Trump appreciated the briefing and said he would meet Kim Jong-un by May to achieve permanent denuclearization. Kim pledged that North Korea will refrain from any further nuclear or missile tests.
By any standards, that appears to be a remarkable diplomatic breakthrough. Earlier, the president, peering into the briefing room, teased reporters that an historic announcement was imminent and characteristically asked to be given the credit. But many veteran diplomats are quick to point out that Kim Jong-un has leveraged his newly developed nuclear arsenal for a huge prize, being treated as an equal by a US president, accompanied by a summit meeting that will be seen as an extraordinary gamble for the White House. Certainly, rapid advances in North Korean missile technology, including the ability to strike the US mainland, have changed the equation. For Donald Trump, there is an added bonus. It dramatically changes the headlines from an impending trade war, the Russian investigation,
Thank you very much, everybody.
and his alleged liaison with a porn actress, to talk now of a potential diplomatic triumph that might transform his political fortunes. They have leveled bitter and petty personal insults at each other. Now the world is waiting to see where this summit is held and how it unfolds.
To our China correspondent, Debbie Edward, in Beijing. Picking up on that, where, Debbie, do you think the meeting is most likely to take place?
Well, previously Beijing would have been seen as a front runner, but China has fallen out of favour with Pyongyang after supporting successive rounds of sanctions. So could we see Kim Jong-un travelling to New York, to the United Nations, making his first foreign trip to the United States, or potentially President Trump coming here to meet him on the North-South Korea border at the DMZ? One interesting suggestion made to me today was that they could be held somewhere like Sweden. Swedish diplomats act on behalf of America in Pyongyang. There are clearly several logistical and security issues to be overcome before any potential summit, but it is being given a cautious welcome here, where just a couple of months ago Kim Jong-un seemed more determined on a path of destruction rather than diplomacy.
Thanks, Debbie. Back now then to our Washington correspondent, Robert Moore. Robert, we expect the unexpected with President Trump, but this meeting would be quite remarkable.
Well, that's true. I mean, look, many diplomats in this town point out this is a stunning diplomatic achievement, for North Korea, that the US, with no preparation, no agenda, having won no concessions, is giving this great prize to Pyongyang that it's been after for decades, not unlike Trump did over the issue of Jerusalem, giving Israel a gift without getting anything, obviously, in return. I think what it underlines, Alistair, is how we have this great showman president, somebody who's prepared at a moment's notice to rip up decades of diplomatic protocol, a man who sees almost everything in terms of a made-for-TV moment, a circus like this summit is certain to be. But it's also fair to say that years of conventional diplomacy have failed. So it's just possible that this kind of unique personal chemistry that may evolve is worth the gamble.
Robert, thank you.
So what happens when little rocket man meets the senile dotard? That's what they called each other before they agreed to meet in May. According to South Korea, Kim Jong-un now says he's open to denuclearization. But is he playing Trump for a fool to get de-Americanization of the Korean peninsula? Or has Trump's big talk and long-standing sanctions worked? As Kylie Morris reports, the announcement of the talks seemed unplanned.
The South Koreans slipped in the side door late in the afternoon, arriving at the White House to brief their American national security counterparts. But what they weren't expecting was for the president to stop by and shift the diplomatic setting to hyperdrive. President Trump agreed, yes, he'd meet Kim Jong-un, and yes, they should go tell the world immediately. Shortly after, the president stopped by to tease the White House press corps. He told them off the record to expect something big from the South Koreans on North Korea. And sure enough, that's what happened. No time for any fancy preparations, just out the front, in the dark, on the White House driveway.
I told President Trump that in our meeting, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un said he is committed to denuclearization. Kim pledged that North Korea will refrain from any further nuclear or missile tests, and he expressed his eagerness to meet President Trump as soon as possible. President Trump appreciated the briefing and said he would meet Kim Jong-un by May.
And who was to credit for this extraordinary breakthrough?
I explained to President Trump that his leadership and his maximum pressure policy, together with international solidarity, brought us to this juncture.
Tonight, toughened sanctions by the international community against Pyongyang have no doubt played some part in changing the landscape. But if you needed a reminder of President Trump's maximum pressure policy, here he is speaking before the United Nations late last year.
The United States has great strength and patience. But if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
That belligerent stance had been the position even until yesterday. Here's the president's own Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, on tour in Africa, declaring negotiations with Pyongyang a long way off.
Because I don't know yet whether the conditions are right to even begin thinking about negotiations.
But that was then. This is today.
In my comments yesterday, I was indicating comments about negotiations, but we've been open for talks for some time.
Some observers warn the North Korean leader is setting a trap that he's won FaceTime with the president without offering up any meaningful or long-term concessions. But others say nothing else was working. Why not try this?
We're not going to get complete denuclearization, but it's worth it if we reduce tensions, some kind of missile freeze, some kind of conventional weapons freeze. Just look, this is going to take a long time, this negotiation. It's a very risky gamble, but I think it's worth taking.
This is improvisational diplomacy between two of the most unpredictable leaders in the world that could all go terribly right or terribly wrong.
And Kylie joins us live now. If Donald Trump knows what he's doing, what is he doing?
Difficult question, Chris. I mean, this is a president, I think, who prides himself on acting intuitively. who believes himself a master deal maker, who is unorthodox and who builds his power with these kind of memorable theatrical moments like the one he staged last night, with proclamations that don't necessarily move much in substance, but that builds his presidential brand. Now, his administration is saying that this is proof that their new approach has worked, that President Trump came into office with a policy to isolate North Korea, to maximize pressure on the regime, and they are the ones who've brought Kim Jong-un to this point. They say the meeting is no reward to North Korea, but it makes sense to meet the one person who can actually make decisions within the regime rather than repeat what they call the long slog of the past. And I think it's important, you can't really underestimate the very real sense that other efforts to force a pause in testing or calm tensions on the Korean Peninsula simply haven't worked. But make no mistake, there are great risks. One way to minimise those, of course, is with very solid preparation for this meeting. We don't know where it's going to be, we don't know the date, but the people who should be doing those preparations, of course, are the master diplomats in the State Department. And it seems pretty clear from what the Secretary of State was saying there that he didn't actually know the president was going to make this decision, and it is his department, where all those analysts once worked, that has been gutted by this administration, and that is, of course, a very real concern. But just as with the announcement on tariffs last week, I think this is diplomacy almost ad-libbed by a president for whom, chaos is a friend, experts aren't to be trusted, and who believes the American people are best served by his instincts and his action.
Thanks, Kylie. So what's prompted this apparent turnaround from Kim Jong-un? Why would he do this? There are many in South Korea in particular who smell a rat in the olive branch, if you'll pardon the expression, as our Asia correspondent Jonathan Miller reports.
The explosive announcement of talks between the two bombasts follows an explosive year in Kim's DPRK. He's test-fired ICBMs that could hit the continental US and detonated what experts agree was a hydrogen bomb. In January, Kim Jong-un stated his nuclear program was non-negotiable. So why the volte-face? Can he be serious? Or is this just a tactic? Donald Trump's branded Little Rocket Man a bad dude and a maniac and warned, don't underestimate him. In that, Trump isn't wrong. North Korea's cocky young Marshal Kim is more Goldfinger than a mad Dr. Evil. His masterful nuclear brinkmanship blindsided and wrong-footed the US and its allies again and again. He's proved impossible to second-guess in his breakneck race for the ultimate deterrent, to guarantee self-preservation. If he's not just trying to buy more time, one clue to Kim's bewildering charm offensive lies in his New Year speech. In which he repeatedly spoke of the harsh challenges posed by what he called life-threatening sanctions. Those sanctions are beginning to bite. It's not just the Korean peninsula that's split down the middle. Public opinion down south is deeply divided. There are hopeful liberals like the president, and there are conservative skeptics.
It's quite right to say we cannot trust Kim Jong-un 100%.
100%? Most people in this country don't trust Kim Jong-un at all.
Oh, you may be right, depending on how you look at it. But the point is, Kim Jong-un has been broken his promises. Since November, North Korea has not been testing missiles.
On Monday, in an unprecedented meeting, Kim Jong-un told high-ranking South Korean officials he wanted to write a new history for the divided peninsula. One of those officials was the national security chief who briefed Trump in the White House last night. This came hot on the heels of last month's Winter Olympics, attended by Kim Jong-un's sister, although she pulled out of a meeting with the US vice president. When the Supreme Leader welcomed his sister's delegation back to the north, he was in a jolly mood and promptly ordered further engagement. Next month, he'll meet the South Korean President Moon Jae-in face-to-face at Panmunjom, the village on the bristling Cold War frontier. And now, Trump the deal-maker may meet North Korea's Supreme Leader in Panmunjom too. What a white-knuckle ride, from fire and fury to peace in our time.
Well, joining me now is Dr. Balbina Huang, a senior advisor to US Ambassador Christopher Hill during his negotiations with North Korea a decade ago. Do you think peace in our time is now within reach?
Oh, no, it's simply far too soon to say that. We have to remember that this is not just about nuclear weapons, but actually an ongoing war that has been suspended since 1953. So there is a lot more here at stake.
If you were advising Donald Trump, what would be the sequence that he could offer in terms of negotiation?
Well, here's the thing that we have to remember. I think everybody is getting confused, or we are conflating, because of all the drama, about what summits are and what negotiations are. And frankly, when we have these dramatic summits between leaders, and this one certainly would be quite historic because there has never been any meeting between a North Korean leader and a US president. But these summits don't necessarily accomplish the hard work of negotiations. And sometimes summits, historical ones, for example, Nixon meeting Mao or Ronald Reagan meeting Gorbachev, these meetings are either set the stage for incredible progress to follow, or they are the final culmination of a very, very difficult negotiations. So we think, obviously, if it's coming up very shortly, it will probably possibly be the beginning of very difficult negotiations ahead.
But as you know, I mean, Trump thinks he is the ultimate deal maker. He doesn't think you need teams of diplomats and Sherpas and all the rest of it. He can do this himself in a room with Kim Jong-un, is I'm sure what he's thinking. But so the question is, what is on, what could be on offer? We know what Kim Jong-un wants. He wants the Americans out of Korea.
Well, that's exactly right. And that is ultimately going to have to be the choice of the United States. And this is exactly what has been set up. If you listen very carefully to what the offer was, and by the way, we have to be very clear about this. The real significance of this offer to meet with President Trump came through the South Korean intermediaries. We must not forget that how incredibly important this is. For the last 70 years, North Korea has tried to delegitimize the role of South Korea, has tried to deal only directly with the United States. And so the fact that this invitation is coming through South Korea is incredibly significant. But in any case, the offer is denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. What most people don't seem to understand is that means, ultimately, that, of course, the Republic of Korea does not have nuclear weapons and has no intention to have nuclear weapons. But that means then that the Republic of Korea must give up its nuclear deterrence protection from the United States. And that does mean the end of the U.S. alliance. And so that is the choice for the United States. A nuclear-free Korea in exchange for the end of the U.S. alliance.
And the end of U.S. troops in Korea. I mean, would South Korea go along with whatever Donald Trump agrees?
Well, that is the point, and I think exactly that is the significance of why the South Korean emissary is the one that came to the White House with this proposal. I think the two Koreas are making clear that this is a decision to be made by the two Koreas, and they are setting a proposal to the United States. And this is the way the alliances work. This is how every single U.S. president has stated that the alliance is based on a mutual decision by the South Korean people, which is a democracy, and the American people, which is also a democracy. So the two countries have to decide if they want to continue the alliance.
I mean, no matter how painful this might be for you politically, do you have to hand it to Donald Trump in some way for getting us here?
Well, again, that's correct. I mean, he has a flair for the drama, and perhaps there is no other president that has been able to make such bold moves. Look, North Korea is a problem that has vexed president after president after president, and particularly the last 3 presidents who have struggled for the last 20 years and put a lot of really hard work and dedication and have been frustrated. And this might be the way to start the breakthrough. I doubt it will be fully accomplished, but perhaps it will start.
Dr. Wang, thank you very much.
I've been getting